So the primary topic we want to discuss is actually scientism. The main
Mm-hmm.
reason because there's like a split in atheist group among Kerala, people who promote scientism and apparently people who oppose it.
Okay,
So
that's interesting.
yeah, so we begin by opposing scientism.
Yeah.
Then we made a few critique video against scientism, but there's a person opposite to us, like an atheist who's a promoter of scientism in Kerala. His
Mm-hmm.
name is Dr. Vishwanandan. So he made a recent video where he actually mentions you and your works. That's how we are interested in knowing more about scientism. Like some of our views might have changed
Mm-hmm.
after hearing uh, your works. So we actually want
Cool.
to invite you and discuss more about it. So that's the main reason we
Sounds
invite
great.
you over. We can start the video by actually defining knowledge, or like when we have to discuss the science is only way of knowing, which is scientism, we
Yeah.
also need to discuss what we meant by knowledge. So what is
Yeah.
actually knowledge in your view?
That's an old chestnut, but you're all familiar with the traditional definition of knowledge, which has existed for many centuries, and it runs into a few technical problems, the famous or infamous Gettier cases. But I think by and large, except for those limiting cases where the definition breaks down, I think it's still a pretty good approximation of what the word knowledge is supposed to mean in everyday language.
Mm.
Because of course, when philosophers talk about knowledge, you can define the term in any way you like, but ideally, of course, you should not stray too far from the meaning that is commonly accepted, at least in English. You can have a similar discussion about other languages. But of course, the most traditional definition of knowledge is consists of three aspects. That it has to be a belief, and then of course we get into a regression about defining belief. But let's assume for the sake of the argument that we know what belief is. So it's knowledge consists of a belief that is true. So it corresponds to the world out there. And then you get into complications about mathematics, etc. But we can talk about that later. And it's justified. So that, I think, is more or less what we mean by knowledge, at least in everyday cases. I think that definition is probably, it's not perfect, because as I mentioned, there's all these Gettier cases. I'm not an expert in the Gettiology, because I also think that these are very clever exceptions or anomalies or contradictions in the traditional definition of knowledge, but I don't think they're very rare and contrived, so you don't really encounter them in everyday life. They're always revolve around some sort of bizarre coincidence where you see something and it's the rabbit and you think it's true, but then actually your perceptual evidence gives you a justified reason to believe it, but then through some sort of other bizarre way it turns out to be true after all. Anyway, so that's I think something that we can put aside for the time being. So true justified belief, I think, is a good enough definition if we're going to talk about scientific versus non-scientific ways of knowing, and the question of science is the best way of knowing, or even the only method of obtaining knowledge.
Okay, so just to clarify the term scientism, just now you said the best way of knowing. Then some of the people define scientism as the only way of knowing. I mean, science is the only way of knowing. Then in your works, I got the impression that the science doesn't have any epistemic limits. This is the definition of scientism. So, which actually is what you meant by scientism, actually.
Yeah, I do think, it has some epistemic limits, of course, in the sense that, to take a very straightforward example, some parts of the universe are so far removed from us that anything that happened there could not have reached us, because the universe is not old enough for us to know anything about that region of the universe. So the speed of light is a very hard physical limit. So in that sense, there are certain parts of the universe. So we have the observable universe, the physicists talk about the light cone. So anything that is within our light cone is something that we can at least potentially learn about, that we can observe. But there are also, allegedly, because we don't really know for sure, of course, parts of the universe that are completely inaccessible, at least for now. So that would be a hard limit of scientific knowledge. But I would say it's not just a limit of scientific knowledge, of course. It's not as if there's some other way of knowing that can allow us to some other way to obtain access to that part of the universe. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that there are no limits at all to the scientific ways of knowing, but I would say that to the extent that there are limits, I don't think that this should be any consolation for people who defend other ways of knowing, because I think if science cannot answer a question, if something is out of reach of science, then there's no other way of knowing that will do the job either. So I'd have the same feeling, for example, about the hypothesis that there may be certain parts of the universe that, even though they are within our light cone, so they're accessible, we can like collect empirical observations about that part of the universe, but for some reason our brains are just not up to the task. You're probably familiar with the hypothesis of cognitive closure, which was initially proposed by Colin McGinn and also in some form by Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor. So this is the idea that our brain, of course, is an evolved organ that has certain specifications and that can represent certain things, and perhaps it also has epistemic limits. So the idea there is that there may be some parts of the universe that we will never be able to comprehend, or we will never be able to represent scientifically. But there again, I think I'm actually more optimistic than Colin McGinn about our ability to extend the reach of the human mind. But if there is such a limit, if it is really true that, for example, the unification of quantum mechanics and gravity, of relativity theory, that will forever remain out of reach of science because of these cognitive limitations, then again, I don't think that intuition or a priori reasoning or religious revelation or any of the other ways of knowing will get us there either. So in that sense, I would again argue that to the extent that there are limits to science, I don't think that there's any other way of knowing that can transcend those limits.
Okay, so whenever I started to learn epistemology, like whenever I go to any introductory books, right, the different type of sources that they teach is actually like testimony, then intuition, a priori belief, then perception. So they aren't actually talking about like science vs revelation or something. Like the ways of knowing is like perception, intuition, testimony, and memory. So how scientism fit in those things? Like,
well,
if I know something, right, I can know by testimony, not just by science. So
that is true, but the problem is that unlike revelation or a priori reasoning, which is completely ruled out in science, testimonial evidence, deductive evidence, perceptual evidence, all of these, of course, are part of the standards methodology of science. So I mean, there's discussion to be had about the distinction between empirical ways of knowing and then radically different ways of knowing, like revelation or a priori reasoning or intuition. But then on the other hand, there's a discussion we can have about the boundaries between everyday forms of knowledge, some of which you mentioned, like testimony and perceptual reasoning and even logical inference, and scientific reasoning. But that boundary is going to be much more blurry and fuzzy than the boundary between scientific ways of knowing and religious revelation, for example. I think you could say that religious revelation just is completely absent from science, for good reasons. I would actually argue that if religious revelation would be at all reliable, it would have been incorporated in the scientific methodology, because the scientific methodology is very open-ended. It's basically anything that works will be incorporated, but we have just tested it and doesn't seem to be reliable at all. But then you have these everyday forms of reasoning, of course, predates science by a very long stretch. So, I mean, we don't know exactly when humans started reasoning or started relying on each other's testimony. But I mean, this has been happening for at least thousands, or perhaps even millions of years, and it's also something that that was acquired very gradually. You can see even like precursors of social knowledge testimony, for example, in animals. There's certain monkeys, for example, that have a code of alarm calls when they're seeing a snake or some other dangerous predator. I mean, we wouldn't really call that full-fledged knowledge, but it is some sort of a precursor of. I mean, you can directly observe a snake as a monkey, and then you know that there's a snake out there, or you can just listen to the alarm call of non-specific another monkey, and then without ever having seen the snake, just assume that it's there and then run for it. So, I mean, the difficulty of defining scientific ways of knowing is that science is a continuation of an extension of everyday forms of knowledge. So there are some philosophers that believe that there is such a thing as the scientific methods that is clearly delineated and that is very special, and that like you can pinpoint in time and place that originated sometime around the scientific revolution in the 16th, 17th century in Western Europe, and that was a radical break from previous forms of knowledge. I don't really agree with that. Of course, there are some things that are relatively unique about science: the institutional structure of science, the scientific experiments, etc. But even those, I think, grow out of everyday forms of reasoning. Even hunter-gatherers, for example, and many anthropologists have described that hunter-gatherers are, in a way, natural scientists. Like if they're tracking animals and they're reasoning about like the imprints of the hoof, for example, that is left by an animal, and how deep it is, and how dry it is, and in what direction it is heading, etc. They're testing hypotheses and they're discussing with each other. And of course, it's not science in the sense that it's not published in peer-reviewed papers, etc. But if you look at it, Napoleon Chagnon has a couple of these very impressive descriptions of logical inference, perceptual knowledge, also testimonial knowledge, everything that we would associate with scientific reasoning, but that long predates science. So I think the difference between everyday forms of reasoning and scientific forms of reasoning will be a very gradual one. It will be a matter of degree. It is a matter of refinement of things that already existed before science, rather than a radical break. The only radical break that I can see is, for example, again, the difference between revelation, religious revelation on the one hand, and then empirical observation on the other hand, for example. There, I don't really see a fuzzy boundary or a lot of overlap. There you really talk about completely different forms of knowledge.
Yeah, okay. But you mentioned, when you explain, you mentioned that a priori beliefs are completely ruled out from science. But there are like some principles that science assumes, like before starting an experiment.
Yeah.
For example, so something like the universe is uniform, maybe. Like, then naturalism. We should adopt a methodology which has naturalism. We must not look for supernatural things. So those are a priori beliefs, or this is a one question, and the second question is like most of the philosophers believe that a priori knowledge exists, but you should obviously rule out that you should obviously say that a priori knowledge doesn't exist, right? Because your view is science is only way of knowing. So these are the two questions.
Yeah, and those are very good questions. And actually, it's interesting that I had a change of mind about that about 10 or 15 years ago, I think, when I was doing my PhD. I also assumed that even though science is non-dogmatic and is open-ended and is following the evidence wherever it leads, there are some very fundamental assumptions in science that you have to except prior to your scientific investigations, and that you cannot do without. That's what I was convinced of when I was starting my PhD. So the regularity in nature, and also the assumption that when you're conducting scientific experiments, that the only forces, the only processes that are interacting with your experiment are natural ones. That there is no supernatural being, for example, that sabotages your investigation or that somehow interferes with with your empirical results. And the idea there was, and I think it's a very intuitive idea. I think now I have come to believe that it's wrong. That if you can't make that assumption, like if you have to take into account that there could be some sort of omnipotent God who is just fiddling with your results, I mean, you can't do science. You can't trust your empirical results at all. So you just you will have to make this assumption that these supernatural beings don't exist, or at least that they don't interfere with your results. And so why did I come to abandon that belief? Because at some point it struck me that it's a very strange form of methodological agnosticism. And I think at the first wedge that was driven into my belief that there are certain a priori assumptions that scientists have to make was exactly about the question of God, because that really makes it very very concrete. Suppose that there is a God and that he can actually perform miracles, or that he can interfere in our natural world, so that he can somehow act as a cause in our universe. Then of course that would be something that is very important to take into account if you're doing experiments. It would be very strange to say on the one hand, okay, I'm not ruling out the existence of such a God, I'm just going to pretend that he doesn't exist and that he doesn't interfere with my experiments, having admitted that he could. And then it struck me that, I mean, if it is really true that there is a God, and that, for example, for whatever reason, he's just messing with your head, and he's just ruining your experiment, for example, by leading you astray, or for whatever reason, because he doesn't want you to know about the structure of the universe, then you could tell that something really strange was happening. You could even experiment with that. You could try out different conditions. None of that has ever happened, of course, in the sense that, I mean, there have been many reports of miracles. People have tried to measure, for example, the mass of the soul, the weight of the human soul, like the idea that when you measure the difference between a corpse, somebody who has died, and somebody who is still alive, and there's a sort of a measurement discrepancy, and that it allegedly is the soul that has left the body. All these things, allegedly supernatural causes operating in the universe. I mean, I think you could carry out scientific investigations trying to rule out these supernatural hypotheses, or these supernatural causes. So then it struck me that if it is true that supernatural beings could interfere with our scientific experiments, I don't think we have to assume a priori that they don't. Of course, many scientists in their everyday work, especially in the 21st century, of course, they would never seriously consider the possibility that, like, when they're looking at something under a microscope, that what they're seeing is not really there, but it's just some sort of illusion created by a demon or by a supernatural being. But that's not because they make a priori assumption. That's just because, and they may not be aware of that throughout the history of science, this assumption that there is a supernatural being that interferes with our universe is an assumption that doesn't have a shred of evidence. So it's not because we have ruled out supernatural explanations from the get-go. It's because supernatural explanations have failed over and over again, and at some point we have just given up on them, and we just don't even mention them anymore. But potentially, I mean, if tomorrow something really strange happened, and if God, for all these thousands of years, had decided to remain hidden and not to reveal himself, but suddenly he had a change of mind and he decided to reveal himself in some sort of spectacular way, that I think, yeah, we could have scientific evidence for that. We could have scientific evidence for miracles. So, okay, that's a kind of a long-winded story. In my PhD thesis, I wrote 2 papers basically arguing that methodological naturalism, so this assumption that many philosophers and many scientists believe that is inherent to the scientific enterprise. You have to assume that there are only natural causes at work, and you have to just rule out supernatural causes during your scientific work. I think that's just a wrong-headed idea. If there is a methodological naturalism in science, it is a sort of provisional assumption, that is based on evidence, the evidence of many attempts to develop supernatural hypotheses and just the repeated failures of all these hypotheses. And I think a similar story could be told about the other thing that you mentioned about the regularity of the universe. That's also an assumption that some scientists would believe is something that you have to accept a priori, because otherwise science is just a non-starter. If there's no regularity at all in the universe, then you cannot even get started with your scientific work. But even that, I think, is also something that is a posteriori, is something empirical that we discovered along the way. It's also not a black or white matter. Some parts of the universe are pretty regular, some parts are very random. Think about quantum mechanics, for example, where we had to abandon our deterministic picture of the universe because some things just happen apparently. That's our current understanding of quantum mechanics without a reason. It's just purely chance-based process. So there is a sort of statistical regularity there, but it's not a regularity in the sense that every configuration of the same causes will always lead to the same effects, which you would have in a deterministic universe. So at the end of the day, I think and that's the paper that I published with Jan Fishman. We defended the idea that science does not make any a priori assumptions prior to starting your scientific work, and that any assumption that you do make is just a provisional empirical assumption that you think you have good evidence for, and that could always be abandoned later on. For example, we believe that there are laws of nature. We believe that the speed of light is just a hard limit, for example, of scientific investigation. I already mentioned the speed of light as a one way to construe the limit of science. But even the laws of nature, for example, could vary across different regions of the universe. If we discover, for example, that the speed of light or other laws of nature only apply in our corner of the universe, potentially we could also acquire evidence for that. I'm not exactly sure what that evidence would consist of, but there are many different physical theories also that speculate that the laws of the universe that we observe in our corner of the universe do not hold everywhere, and that there's variation in the laws of the universe. So even something as fundamental as a law of physics could also be up for grabs, and could also potentially be refuted. Think about a couple of years ago, there was this experiment about faster than light neutrinos. Turned out to be wrong. It was a measurement issue, and I'm not a physicist, so I'm not sure exactly what happened. But for a time, at least a part of the physicist community was convinced that we had refuted relativity theory because we had discovered a particle that was traveling faster than light. So I think basically in science, anything is up for grabs. Anything could be revised further down the line, and you only get the impression that you're making prior assumptions because you have been making them for so long that you don't really treat them as assumptions anymore. You just don't. You forgot about the history of their success and of the failure of the alternatives. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. Why I think that science doesn't need to assume from the outset that there are regularities in nature, that there are only natural causes at work, that the laws of physics are constant. All of these things, I think, are potentially up for grabs.
Okay, now for the section B, most of the philosophers lean towards accepting that there is a priori knowledge. Yeah.
Razi, just a second. Am I audible?
Yes, but your voice is very feeble.
Okay. I just wanted to know what Maarten thought about the assumption of we need to trust our senses to do science.
We need to trust what exactly?
Oh,
senses.
so there's an assumption the scientists take, like we have to trust our perception,
Okay.
before we do
But
science.
actually, we don't. We only trust our assumption. We only trust our perception to the extent that we have good reasons to assume that this time our perceptual abilities will not fail us. But if we hallucinate, for example, we don't trust our perception. If we are, if we find ourselves in a situation where we are prone to visual illusions, I mean, the very fact that we can discover visual illusions means that we don't always trust our perceptual senses. I mean, the Muller-Lyle illusions, for example, where you have the illusion that two lines are of equal length. It's a very simple demonstration in which we don't trust our senses. Our senses tell us one thing, and then we just measure. I mean, indirectly, of course, we're still using our senses, but we can actually circumscribe the limits of our senses indirectly by using scientific reasoning, and also indirectly, of course, also the evidence of our senses, but then evidence of our senses in more reliable context. So even at a very fundamental level, I think you could ask yourself, how can we know that we're not living in the matrix, or that we don't live in an illusion that is created by some sort of Cartesian demon or in some sort of hologram or whatever? Because then, of course, that would be such a massive level of deception of our senses that we could not possibly find, like, work our way out of that predicament. But I think even something like that, you can just consider the hypothesis that we're living in a computer simulation or in the matrix, and then weigh it against its alternatives. And I think there's actually good evidence that the assumption of a real world out there, so not a computer simulation, but a real world that we're interacting with, is just the most simple hypothesis of the robustness of our observations. So I don't think we can logically rule out that we're living in the matrix or that we're living in a computer simulation, but I do think that we have good reason to trust our senses at that most fundamental level, basically because of statistical probabilities. Just ask any computer engineer if you want to simulate a world that you can really interact with seamlessly, like without any sort of delay or without any glitches. It's extremely difficult to do. So even in a computer game, it's very hard to convince yourself that that this is the real world, because there's always like the dynamic nature of it is very different from the way that we're interacting with the real world. So I would say even the assumption that we can that at least we can trust our senses some of the time in very mundane and straightforward situations, like there's a glass on the table right in front of me. I think we can have good evidence for that. I'm not sure if that was the most lucid explanation for it. So the question was, can we trust the evidence of our senses, right? But there's different ways to construe the question, so I'm not sure if I answered
I was asking about the matrix question. I think, you are right. Like, I agree with your thinking, but can you say that you're doing science when you say that you are not living in the matrix? When you say that, we are most probably not living in the matrix. When you say that, are you doing science, or are you like some kind of assumption is going on there? Or
that's a good question. Are you doing science? Yeah, it depends on what you mean. I think it's not the sort of question that you can submit to a scientific journal and publish on. I mean, because it's all encompassing. It's not the kind of question that scientists in any field ask. But still, I think that at the most fundamental level, it is also at least partly a scientific question. The fact is that it is so broad and general and so removed from any sort of specific experiment or observation that we could also justifiably call it a metaphysical question. But I don't really think there's a bright line to be drawn between science and metaphysics. I think the answer that I just gave, that I think that the existence of the real world out there is the most simple and parsimonious explanation for the world that we observe, or the perceptual evidence that we seem to be receiving. That is partly, I think, a scientific way of reasoning. It is a scientific way of reasoning just at the highest level of abstraction. Most of the time, for example, when you're asking specific questions about DNA, why do we assume that DNA exists? Well, or why did we, I mean, now, of course, we have many different ways of even just reading DNA sequences one letter after the other. But let's go back to when the structure of DNA was initially discovered. How do we know that DNA exists? At some point, there's just a sort of the weight of circumstantial evidence at some point makes the existence of DNA the most simple and straightforward explanation for everything that we observe. That, I think, is the way science works in specific cases when it comes to positing the existence of specific entities like DNA or electrons or quarks or whatever. The existence of the world is also a hypothesis like that, but it's just a hypothesis about the existence of things at the most general level. But I think the answer that you're giving is similar in structure to the answer that you're giving for why I believe in the existence of protons. Protons could be an illusion. I mean, it could be that we're completely mistaken about them, but at some point it becomes extremely unlikely that even though we have never directly observed them, there's so many ways that we can measure them and that we can theorize about them, and these theories lead to accurate predictions, etc. So that we at some point we assume that the existence of the proton is just it's just taken for granted. It's the most simple explanation, and I think you could say something similar about the world in general. I mean, there's a lot of things. I think it's good to break down the question of realism into specific parts and segments, because when we talk about the existence of the world, I mean, our everyday world, the world of tables and chairs. Well, even there, existence is also dependent on how exactly you construe it, because according to quantum mechanics, of course, there is a way in which the solidity of a table and a chair, for example, does not exist. That is merely an illusion. It's mostly empty space, and it's basically just the attraction and the repelling of elementary particles that gives us the illusion of stability, of robustness, of solidity. So I think, even a question like the existence of everyday objects, so not even non-observable objects, but the existence of everyday objects like tables and chairs, and even the existence of the whole world, is a question that has to be answered by scientific means. Science does not have to assume from the start that the real world exists out there. If we do live in the matrix, I could even conceive of scientific evidence that would demonstrate that, or that at least that would kind of put pressure on the belief that the world as it exists out there really exists. I mean, in the Matrix, in the movie The Matrix, I think there are even certain anomalies. They're called glitches in the Matrix, certain things that are bizarre, that are hard to explain. I think deja vu is one of them, if I recall. So there's certain experiences that you have within the Matrix that are that provide you some clues that this is not the real world. You're living in a computer simulation. But that is a sort of empirical evidence. So perhaps even if we were living in a computer simulation, there would be ways of finding out.
Okay, let's come back to the a priori question. Like most of the philosophers agree or unanimously agrees that a priori beliefs exist. So only a minute percentage, I guess, actually believe that a priori or doesn't exist. So how you justify that?
Well, so this is not in the context of science, but just in general, that just a priori beliefs that we have even before the existence of science, right? Yeah. If you mean by a priori beliefs that are innate, then I think they do exist. But in one sense, they are not a priori because they are still the result of empirical observation or of like trial and error, except that the trial and error should be situated on evolutionary time and not on within the lifespan of a single human being. So I do think that evolution has endowed us with certain beliefs about the world, or at least certain ways of approaching the world, a certain intuitive understanding of physical objects, and intuitive understanding of living beings, and that's not a coincidence, because we have been interacting with physical objects and with living beings for millions of years, and at some point, because of the stability of these objects, these living beings in our environment, evolution has decided, I mean, quote unquote, of course, evolution is not an endowment process. It's just something mindless and blind, but it has endowed us with certain intuitive beliefs about the world as a sort of starter. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge that you have to acquire throughout your lifetime, because not everything in your environment stays exactly the same. But there's certain parts of the environment, for example, the existence of gravity or the existence of living beings, that have been remaining constant throughout evolutionary time. And in that sense, I do think we have a priori beliefs. We have already something to start from the moment that we're born. But as I mentioned, indirectly, I still think these are empirical beliefs, because evolution still had to come up with these beliefs and test them against the evidence. And the organisms, or our human ancestors, for example, that had the wrong a priori belief, a priori belief that led them astray, or that didn't really capture the world out there, well, those ancestors probably, or those hominids probably didn't make it into our ancestors. They didn't survive.
Okay, now you mentioned evolution as a partial source of our knowledge. I want to ask you that whether evolution could misguide us by giving us unreliable or false information. So basically, it's the EAN, the Plantinga's argument.
Yeah. I think evolution can definitely mislead us. For one thing, evolution doesn't care about the truth at all. Evolution just cares about one thing: survival and reproduction. If it is more fitness in enhancing, for example, to endow us with false beliefs about our environment, then evolution will have no qualms or hesitations about doing so. So potentially, I think it is perfectly possible that we have false beliefs that are that we have innate beliefs that are false, and that are the result of evolution. I think if you look at the specific details and you try out different scenarios, different possibilities of innate beliefs that are false, I think there are not a lot of them. There are not really a lot of good candidates. And I mean, like, really false beliefs, because many of our beliefs are false in the sense that they are imperfect approximations of reality. So our intuitive physics, for example, is false because it is Euclidean, for example. I mean, it only works without the presence of massive objects, for example, or very strong gravitational forces. So in that sense, it is false, but it is really, like, it's a good it's a good solution, or it's a good approximation if you want to survive in the savannah, for example, as a hunter-gatherer 2 million years ago. Our intuitive understanding of living beings is also false in the sense that we have an intuitive conception of essentialism. So people intuitively treat living beings as having some sort of a hidden essence, and that's one of the reasons why they find it hard to accept evolution, because evolution thinks in terms of populations, and populations that are slowly or gradually changing and changing into intermediate forms between two different species. So again, to some extent, essentialism is false, but then it is, again, in an everyday context, as treating every human being, like you have snakes and you have spiders and you have dogs, whatever, as if they belong to some sort of a separate category, and all of these categories have certain essential features. It's wrong, but it's a kind of useful falsehood, and it's a falsehood that is at least approximately true, because if you don't care about the evolutionary history of these animals, it is still it's a decent heuristic to treat them as if they belong to separate categories that never overlap and that have a certain shared essence. So those, if you think that those are false beliefs, then I think it is, yeah, then I would definitely answer the question affirmatively. Evolution has endowed us with false beliefs. But I think in those cases, evolution is just striking a balance between accuracy and usefulness. So a belief can be less than accurate, for example, but still approximately true, but be useful in everyday life to survive and reproduce. Because perfectly accurate beliefs, of course, are costly, and evolution is only going to endow us with just the minimal level of truth, the minimal level of true belief that is necessary to survive and reproduce. So for those things, so intuitive physics and intuitive biology, I wouldn't really call them false beliefs. I think it's just like a trade-off between usefulness and accuracy. But I think there's another category of beliefs, the beliefs that are really completely false, like that are completely illusory. Daniel Dennett wrote a very influential paper about this hypothesis together with the psychologist Ryan McKay in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I think it's already 15 years ago now. Adaptive misbelief, or the evolution of misbelief. That's the idea, as you said, that there are some beliefs that are not just imperfect approximations of reality, but that are flat out false, and that are still adaptive somehow, that evolution has endowed us with. The only thing that they come up with, so they run through a number of candidates, and at the end of the day, they think that only so-called positive illusions, so these are illusions of self-enhancements, overconfidence, excessive optimism about the future, that these beliefs could be adaptive because they make it more likely that we succeed and that we're motivated to work harder, to be more successful, etc. So the idea that you think that the future is bright, and you think that you're slightly more talented and more attractive than is really the case, and that you have more control over your environment than is really the case. There's some good evidence that suggests that these beliefs are universal, so you see them across all of humanity. And there's a certain adaptive value to these beliefs. Even there, I think I'm still skeptical. For one thing, being completely deluded about yourself and about your environments could be very dangerous. There's an example that I like to use. It's from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I forgot the name, but they have this device. It's a sort of sunglass that you can wear, and it works by just screening out anything that is in your environment, just turning black whenever something appears that is frightening to you. So when a dangerous predator arrives on the scene, for example, it turns dark, and you have nothing to worry about anymore because you don't see it anymore. Obviously, I mean, the joke, of course, being that this would be extremely harmful in your environment. So just being optimistic about what is right in front of you, it definitely has certain limits. I mean, it could be that it is adaptive or beneficial to be slightly optimistic, to be slightly overconfident, but there's definitely also a fine line to tread, because if you're completely deluded about your environment or about the future or what is right in front of you, then that is not going to be very conducive to survival and reproduction. There's also some evidence, by the way, that these beneficial illusions also have harmful side effects. There's a book by Dominic Johnson about overconfidence and war that basically shows that many wars in modern history have been caused or have been provoked by generals and leaders that were overconfident, that were thinking so highly of themselves that they completely ruled out the possibility that they could ever lose, or that they could ever lose in a military context, in a war. So I think there's a lot of evidence also that these positive illusions are harmful. So at the end of the day, some people would argue that the belief in free will is an adaptive illusion. But since I'm a compatibilist about free will, I think that it's not necessarily an illusion, so it also not qualify as an adaptive illusion. I think that it's perfectly okay to have a belief in free will even in a deterministic world. So it is possible that evolution is fooling us in some respects, because again, evolution doesn't care about truth. But then if you look at specific details, I think by and large, in almost every circumstance, the truth is just extremely useful. Whatever you want to achieve in life, whether it's about surviving or reproducing or any other thing that you're aiming for in the world, you need to have an accurate representation of the world, or at least an approximately accurate representation, in order to navigate through the world and to reach your goal. So in almost all situations that I can think of, the truth is conducive to fitness, and for that reason, I think adaptive illusions, if they are real, are probably very rare. And I think probably the only adaptive illusions are adaptive illusions that are wrong in some respects, but that are approximately true in other respects, the ones that I already mentioned, namely intuitive physics and intuitive biology. They are not exactly right, but they're accurate enough to be helpful for us in our environment.
Should we reduce our confidence in our beliefs because we are evolved creatures?
I don't think we should. I mean, we should reduce our confidence in our beliefs if we are reasoning in an area for which our brains have not evolved. I think so. Our confidence should be moderated, I think, by the context in which we find ourselves. If we're reasoning about, for example, things that have been existing for millions of years, let's say fear of heights, just your intuitive aversion to heights, to falling off a cliff or a precipice. Well, that is something that you really can trust your brain on, because it's a situation that your brain has encountered for many thousands, for millions of years. That's exactly what our brains have evolved to do, to protect us against these forms of dangers. The further you remove yourself from these kinds of situations that were common in our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, the less confidence you should put on the deliverances of your cognitive faculties. So, for example, as a philosopher, if you're looking at quantum mechanics or relativity theory and you have certain intuitions like this cannot possibly be right, that's really an area where you should be very skeptical of your own brain, because your brain did not evolve to understand reality at subatomic level. And so any intuitions that we have about that part of reality are bound to be completely unreliable. But again, intuitions in everyday context, intuitions about situations that have occurred many thousands of times across our evolutionary history, will tend to be very reliable. I think I'm actually pretty positive or favorable towards intuitions. There's a book by Gerd Gigerenzer, a German psychologist, called Gut Feeling. It actually shows that in many situations, again in situations that are similar to the ones that we have encountered many times in our evolutionary past, intuitions, even gut feelings, just having the feeling that you cannot explain, that you cannot even justify, can be very reliable. So one example that he gives is firefighters that are extinguishing a fire in a building, and all of a sudden they have this gut feeling that there's something amiss. They can't really explain, they can't really point to any sound or any smell or whatever in their environment, but they just decide we have to get out of this building right now. So they just drop everything, and then as it happens, the building collapses. In many of these situations, it is rational even to trust your gut feeling, because your gut feeling itself is the result of many rounds of trial and error. It is something that has evolved for a reason, to protect you against danger. So in these situations, intuitions are very reliable. In other situations, they are far less reliable.
Okay, now we can get back to the science question, because in most of your articles, you mentioned that science broadly construed is the only way of knowing.
Broadly construed, yeah.
Yeah. So, what is science according to you?
The reason why I talk about science broadly construed is that the definition and the boundaries of science, the word science, are partly the result of the vagaries of history and of linguistics. So in some languages, like German, you have the term Wissenschaften, which in many people's understanding is more inclusive than the English word science. In English, you would often talk about science versus humanities. But in German, for example, Wissenschaft would include the humanities. I don't really think anything important hinges on purely linguistic distinctions. So that's why in English, just to avoid any confusion, I talk about science broadly construed, including also things like the humanities and history. Another aspect, I think, of just the phrase broadly construed is that there are certain things that are not like ordinarily seen as parts of science, forms of everyday knowledge, for example, but that could be the subject of scientific investigation. Like in my chapter in the Science Unlimited book, I think I used the example of a plumber. We would not really call a plumber a scientist. I mean, for any number of official reasons, because he's working on his own, he's not really collaborating with anyone else, he's not publishing in journals, he's not submitting his papers, he's not attending conferences. Why? Well, not because fixing my my sink, for example, is a non-scientific problem. No, because it is a problem that is simple enough to be solved by someone on his own. It's not a limit of science. It's not as if science does not have any authority to make any pronouncements about sewage systems or about sinks, the things that plumbers are working on. It's just that, I mean, we have a division of labor, and some problems are sufficiently difficult and sufficiently out of reach from like direct perceptual evidence that we need large collaborations of people that are pooling their resources and that are standing on each other's shoulders, in the famous phrase by Newton, because they're so difficult to solve, and also they're of a more general nature. Of course, when my plumber is trying to solve a problem, he's trying to solve a very local, narrow, specific problem related to my kitchen. He's not trying to solve the hydrodynamics of water or fluids in general. But I don't really think that much of epistemic significance hinges on that distinction. So that's why if I talk about the limits of science, I just want to rule out these kind of non-interesting limits. I mean, you could say, if you're inclined to say that a plumber is not a scientist, I'm fine. I mean, it depends on your definition. I'm willing to agree with you, but I don't really think that that's anything interesting about the limits of science. And much more interesting questions, of course, are there certain things that certain questions that science cannot answer. Science is not interested in my kitchen, for obvious reasons, because it doesn't really have any relevance for anyone except me. But are there any problems that science cannot possibly solve? And then are there any problems that could be solved by other ways of knowing? That I think is a much more interesting question to ask than the difference between science and plumbing, for example.
Okay, so when a plumber actually do his work, you kind of refer him as doing science, even though normally we won't call it. So just a question, like, is science just an abduction from observable facts? Like,
I think it is. I think that you would be very hard pressed to find anything, any method of inference or of observation that is not used by a plumber, but that is used by scientists. The scientist is making inferences about what is happening under the microscope, for example. But so is the plumber. The plumber is also trying to rule out different hypotheses about where the leak is, for example. He's observing, he's testing things, he's ruling out hypotheses, he's using abduction, he's trying to come up with the most simple explanation for what is happening and trying to rule out more like elaborate or far-fetched hypotheses. Science is growing out of human forms of rationality that long predate science. It's a more sophisticated form of human reasoning, of course, but it's not something that is radically different. So even when it comes to experiments, I think to some extent you could say that even the plumber is doing an experiment when he's ruling out certain hypotheses. The hunter-gatherers are also doing experiments when they are trying to figure out, for example, where an animal is hiding. The anthropologist that I mentioned, Napoleon Charion, has this famous description of an hunter-gatherer tribe that is trying to smoke out, literally, an armadillo, an animal that is hiding in its burrows, and they are really experimenting. They're testing out different hypotheses, like listening to the ground and seeing if they hear the sounds of the animal, then just digging a hole and ruling out that it is in one specific place and going to another place, then driving smoke with a fire through one of its burrows to suffocate the animal. So all of these things, I think, really strike us as scientific forms of reasoning, except for the superficial differences. Obviously, it's not. I mean, these are illiterate cultures. They're not writing scientific reports. They're not. I mean, they are collaborating because this is done by a group of people. They are not writing papers. They're not attending conferences. But I think, at a more fundamental level, what happens at a cognitive level, I think is very similar to what is happening in the mind of a scientist.
Yeah. So, like when on the way to my home, if I see a wet place and I inferred that it was raining here, is it still science? Like your definition pretty much says it's.
I mean,
science.
it's not. Again, it's a trivial scientific fact. I think science start out with problems that are non-trivial. I mean, you start out with all the things that you already know or you think you know. Sometimes everyday forms of knowledge can be corrected by science, of course. But if something is too trivial, too directly observable, just too easy, then it's not going to be of any interest to scientists, because scientists are always building further on what is already known. So a problem like, yeah, the ground is wet, so the most plausible hypothesis is that it's raining. I mean, that's just going to be met with a shrug of shoulders, because it's too blatantly true. It's not something that you can just infer that in a split second, and it's. But for example, take the extinction of the dinosaurs. That's also a specific event that is very similar, for example, to how a detective solves a crime. So a detective is also not really a scientist, for all the reasons that I already mentioned, when he's trying to figure out who murdered someone. He's ruling out different hypotheses, he's making inferences, etc. But when it comes to the extinction of the dinosaurs, of course, no single human being would be able to figure out that murder mystery, I mean, you quote unquote, on his own. So that's why you need science. And it took a lot of time, took a lot of hard work, took a lot of different testing of hypotheses to figure out what happened exactly, what was the culprits of the extinction of the dinosaurs. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the solution. Eventually, they discovered a smoking gun. I mean, I keep using these detective terms because I think they're really useful here. The smoking gun was a natural concentration of iridium, a very rare element on Earth, in certain layers around the 65 million years ago in geological layers. What is it called again? The Cretaceous. And the hypothesis was that this iridium had an extraterrestrial origin, and indeed, sometime later, the crater in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico was discovered, where this meteorite had struck, and that is the most likely culprit, according to our modern understanding of paleontology, of the extinction of the dinosaurs. This is really like extremely similar to how a detective solves a crime. That's also why I mentioned the term like a smoking gun. It is abductive, And it is also interesting because this is an instance in which scientists are trying to solve a specific problem, a specific event that happens in our evolutionary history. Because sometimes people have this impression that scientists are only looking to find the general laws of nature. And of course, some parts of science are doing exactly that. We don't want to explain particular instances of natural events. We want to find the regularities, and at the most fundamental level, we want to discover the most general laws of nature. But that doesn't cover all of science. Sometimes science or scientists are also looking to find an explanation for a very specific event. In this case, the extinction of the dinosaurs. I mean, this is like uncontroversially science. I mean, nobody would dispute that intellectual work was scientific, but it is very close in terms of inference making, in terms of observations, to what a detective is doing, or even to what a plumber is doing.
Finally, like, we need to respond some of the arguments put forward by apologists. I have a list of 5 things that science failed to explain. So this is the
all right.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go through the 5 of them. So the first one is logic and mathematics. The second one is metaphysical truths, such as whether God exists or not. Then ethical beliefs, then aesthetic beliefs, like what is beauty, then science itself. So you can go one by one. So the first one is logic and mathematics.
Logic, right?
Yeah, first one is logic and
logic.
mathematics.
Logic and mathematics, I guess.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. First of all, science is using logic and mathematics all the time. I mean, it's very hard to disentangle logic and mathematics from science. When it comes to pure logic and mathematics, I don't really think you're talking about knowledge in the first place. Logic is not about what is true, but about what you can derive from things that you already know to be true. Logical inferences that are valid are truth preserving. Like, they assume that if you have a true premise, then you can derive some conclusions. If the premise is false, of course, then all bets are off. I mean, the conclusion could be true, could be false. That's something that logic is completely silent about. So logic itself is not a method of obtaining knowledge without some sort of empirical input. So I don't really think that's a good example of a limit of scientific knowledge, unless you're some sort of a Platonist, if you believe that logic or mathematics exists in some sort of Platonic realm, some sort of parallel universe. But that's not really the most useful way to think about logic and mathematics. Mathematics is also, it's more usefully thought of as a series of games that we play with rules that we set up. And those rules are to some extent arbitrary. And some of these games result in interesting results, and some of them in less interesting results. And it's up to us to decide which branch of mathematics that we want to pursue. So, for example, in classical mathematics, if you can't really derive a square root of a negative number, you could say, well, okay, that's just mathematically impossible. But what if you just design a mathematical system in which the square root of -1 does exist, and you just call it a specific number, and then you see how the game develops if you just introduce that new rule. And then, of course, you have the mathematics of imaginary numbers, and it turned out to be an extremely interesting form of mathematics that is also used in quantum mechanics. It doesn't really mean that it's true or that it's not true. It just means that, I mean, it is true within the system, within the context of the game that you have set up. You can say that some mathematical things are true or false or contradictory, but there's no like realm of mathematical truths that is out there. So I don't really think that's the best way to think of it. So yeah, I think that basically covers the first objection, right?
Okay, yeah. The second objection, basically, you have covered in the first section of the discussion, that some of the metaphysical questions can be addressed by science, like whether God exists or not.
Yeah.
Supernatural vs naturalism you have explained a bit, but you can expand on that. You can also include, like, is intelligent design as scientific? Like, are they using science to determine whether God exists or not in when they
Well,
are using?
as it exists now, intelligent design is a pseudoscience, and they are a pseudoscience because, as it happens, we live in a universe in which there is no evidence of design. And if there is no evidence of design, and you still want to pretend that there is evidence, well, then you have to engage in a lot of evasive strategies and maneuvers that turns your theory into a pseudoscience. But potentially, intelligent design is perfectly legitimate science. We could be living in a universe that was designed by a creator. That we could be living in a computer simulation. I already mentioned that. We could be living in some sort of a wait. Let me rephrase that. Intelligent design, basically inferring the existence of a designer from functional complexity, for example, is not just potentially scientific, it is actually scientific in many contexts. If we find if we find a human artifact, for example, if archaeologists find an artifact that they have not discovered before, and then they infer that it is not some sort of natural object, that it is too complex to be the result of natural forces, and it must have an intelligent designer, that's perfectly legitimate, and they can have very good reasons to do so. There are actually telltale signs of design when you look at objects. Before the advent of evolutionary theory, so before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, we didn't really have an alternative explanation for functional complexity in nature apart from intelligent design. And I think especially in the period before Darwin, intelligent design was actually the most viable scientific hypothesis. I think that if I had been living before the emergence of evolutionary theory, then probably I would have been a proponent of intelligent design, because at that point, you always have to compare the value of one scientific hypothesis with other scientific hypotheses. Like hypothesis testing is always contrastive. And at that point, there was not really a good competitor. So now that we know about the mechanism of natural selection, we no longer treat functional adaptations in nature as evidence of design. We have a much better explanation now. But that doesn't mean that inferring the whole endeavor of trying to infer intelligent design from certain telltale traces in an object, that's not necessarily unscientific. So again, it's hard to drive home this point without really coming up with some sort of outlandish counterfactual scenario. That's what I always do when I'm making this argument, is that we live in a universe in which there is no evidence of intelligent design. I don't think there is a God, and at least if there is a God, he's completely absent and he doesn't really interfere with our world. But it is perfectly possible to imagine a universe in which not only God exists, but the evidence for existence are just all over the place. And it's just so incontrovertible that there wouldn't be any atheists, because it's so obvious that there is a God. I think just thinking about those alternative counterfactual universes just makes us understand the point that intelligent design is not unscientific per se. It's just unscientific in our universe, because it has been tried and tested. At some point, it had some scientific value, but then there was a better alternative. It was rejected. It was abandoned. And anyone who still defends it now has to resort to dirty tricks, basically immunizing strategies, ad hoc maneuvers, etc. And that makes it a pseudoscience. But it's not necessarily a pseudoscience. It's only a pseudoscience in our world.
Okay. What is your thoughts about ontological arguments? They are actually using a priori beliefs. They are not using any premises which has scientific conclusions. So
I think this is an example of what we mentioned earlier. You should not trust your brain when you set up arguments like that. Your brain has not evolved to do these things. So arguments that are so general and abstract and that are so removed from like everyday knowledge or direct observations, it's so easy to be led astray and to smuggle in some sort of an intuition that you have that only has a limited range of application and that works in everyday contexts, but that is completely misleading you in other contexts. I think many of these arguments for the existence of God, ontological argument, and other ones as well, are basically committing those mistakes. And also, I mean, to the extent that they prove anything, it's not the sort of God that most people think of. It's not this personal God. It's some sort of a first cause or the unmoved mover or stuff like that. I mean, even for the sake of the argument, we would accept that the arguments are valid or that the inferences are valid, which they are not. It's still not really an existence proof of any sort of personal God that the religious believers are interested in. So there's a bit of a bait and switch going on with many of these extremely abstract arguments for that prove the existence of God, because I mean they're basically just using the three-letter word God, G-O-D, and then hoping that people would somehow mistake it for the real thing. I mean, the God in the Bible, but what they are trying to demonstrate in these arguments is nothing like the personal God that many religious beliefs think of.
Now we'll move on to the third one on the list, which is ethical beliefs. Morality cannot be explained by science. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think any way of knowing, any methods or inference can really objectively establish moral truths. So I agree that you cannot just observe moral truths under a brain scanner, for example. You cannot say that you have scientifically proven that utilitarianism is the one true moral framework. But again, that's not any comfort or consolation to advocates of different ways of knowing, because if science cannot do it, I don't think any method can do it. Philosophers also cannot, I think, definitively prove that one moral system is better or is objectively right or wrong, because I don't think there are moral truths to begin with. I think morality is a human invention. That is part of our natural endowments. It's something that you can explain in evolutionary terms. We are a very social and gregarious species, so we need some way to live together to avoid conflict, because many other species, of course, are extremely aggressive. The strength of the human species lies in cooperation, at least on the level of a group. And I think morality has emerged as a solution to that problem, and has certain intuitions that are attached to it, and that we feel as just naturally true, because that's just the way that evolution has wired us. But that doesn't mean that there are any objective moral truths out there. So this is only a problem, I think, if you believe that there are moral truths in the first place. So I don't think that's the case. So yeah, again, we can dismiss the third point, I think.
Okay, so your answer will be same, I guess, for the fourth one on the list, which is aesthetic beliefs.
Oh yeah, that even more obviously, aesthetic beliefs are just purely a function of the vagaries of our evolutionary history, just certain things, certain patterns, certain regularities. Symmetry, for example, is appealing to us, not because it's objectively beautiful, but just because there are good evolutionary reasons. For example, symmetry of the human face is mostly indicative of health and fitness. So that's why we appreciate symmetry, and that has probably also been extended to other contexts, like in paintings, for example. We also appreciate symmetry, but there's the aesthetic truths only exist in the eye of the beholder. I think it's a little bit more complicated for ethical truths, because there I think I also have at least the intuition that it's just objectively wrong to torture someone. It's a very strong feeling that I have. With aesthetic beliefs, I think the feeling is far less strong. I think all of us are aware that aesthetic beliefs are partly subjective. So I think, yeah, if ethical beliefs don't pose a problem to to scientism, then I think a fortiori then aesthetic beliefs won't do that either. Did I say that correctly now?
Yeah, sure. So we will go to the last one on the list, which is science itself. So science actually need philosophy to define, demarcate what it is, how it should be done, and so how you reply for that?
I think it's true that science needs philosophy. They both need each other. They cannot do without each other. But that doesn't mean that philosophy is prior to science. It doesn't mean that you first have to provide philosophical foundations before you can get the scientific endeavor off the ground. So I do think when I look at my own philosophical work, for example, I try to resolve some conceptual problems. I try to, straighten out some wrinkles in scientific methodology, or at least as I see them. For example, the stuff that I talked about with methodological naturalism. But I don't really see myself as just doing something like providing the preconditions for doing science or something to that effect. I think I'm also relying on science as a philosopher, obviously. When I'm thinking of the evolutionary arguments for the reliability of our senses, of our cognitive faculties, for example, then I'm relying on evolution, obviously. So I think we should think more of science and philosophy as being in a relationship of mutual interdependence, rather than the traditional and kind of also arrogant philosophical conception of philosophy being prior to science, or philosophy being somehow more important than science, or providing the foundations for science. I think this does not work at all. There's no vantage point from nowhere. You always have to start with something, just with the situation that you find yourself in. We're evolved human beings, so there's no way to, I mean, the moment that you want to establish some sort of ultimate foundation of anything, you will end up with a vicious regression, or you will end up with circular arguments. And then, because of course you could always say, well, why should you trust that? What's the foundation of that foundation? Like if you're trying to establish the reliability of your cognitive faculties, I mean, anything you do, any kind of argument that you come up with is already relying on your cognitive faculties. So it's becoming circular. I think we should embrace that circularity and just say, there's no way to escape that. We're just evolving. We have to start from somewhere, and now we have to slowly work our way up, trying to refine and to improve and to correct the everyday knowledge that we started with, and then slowly circling around and trying to come up with just a worldview, but not trying to pursue this sort of foundationalist approach. So I think it's not just that. I think philosophy does not provide the foundations to science. I think just any kind of foundationalist approach that wants to set up a worldview from the ground up, just building secure foundations for a worldview, is basically a non-starter, because that's just not how it works. We found ourselves in medias res. We found ourselves as evolved beings, with the cognitive faculties that we have, and then we have to start working with those.
So your suggestion is actually to take coherentism instead of foundationalism, because ultimately foundationalism will fail, because either there's a regress at the bottom, or most people resort to unjustified a priori belief as the foundational beliefs. Then they have to change their foundation,
although I don't really like the term coherentism either, because then of course I mean, then you might think that all you need to have a true worldview is for your beliefs to cohere. I mean, that of course is not sufficient. I mean, you can have a perfectly coherent belief system that is completely false and that is completely unmoored from reality. So you need to make some sort of contact with reality, of course. But the contact with reality that you make is kind of piecemeal, is step by step, is gradually improving, and it's not securing like one infallible foundation, either an abstract philosophical foundation or a perceptual foundation, because like you can also have a sort of a perceptualist foundationalism as well, the idea that we have to start with the evidence of our senses as the kind of secure groundwork that everything else is built on. I think that's also a non-starter, because everything has to be up for grabs. Even the reliability of our senses should also be amenable for correction and for refinement. So it's more, rather than thinking of it as a sort of structure, as a structure that needs foundations. I think I like the metaphor of Susan Haag, who thinks of science in terms of a crossword puzzle, where you're starting from anywhere. Like there's no right way to start a crossword puzzle, but as you find horizontal and vertical solutions, then your framework becomes more tightly interconnected, and you can have more and more confidence that you're on the right track. But there's no starting points, really. It's more like a web of beliefs that have many interrelated strands and that also make contact with reality. But there's no starting point or foundation to be found anywhere in such a web.
Yeah. So last but not the least, I just want to ask about the self-defeating allegation against scientism. Like, is science the only way of knowing? That proposition cannot be known by science. So,
well,
yeah, this
I
is
think
the
it's
most
only
famous objection most people do against scientism.
Yes, but it's only a self-defeating proposition if you have a very narrow conception of science. If you think science is only about conducting experiments, for example, then obviously scientism would be self-defeating, because in order to justify scientism, I mean, you need something more than a scientific experiment. You cannot conduct a scientific experiment that will demonstrate the truth of scientism. If you have a broader conception of science, of course, that includes this idea of constant refinement and improvements of your beliefs and your theory, then I think scientism is not necessarily self-defeating. It is also something that that is open for revision. So if, like, for the time being, I think science is the best way of knowing, and is the most superior way of knowing, the most successful one. But it is at least logically possible that someday in the future that we will suddenly discover that religious revelation, for example, or intuition, or some sort of oracle is more reliable than science, and we could discover that by scientific means in a way. It gets a little bit paradoxical because, of course, you could always argue that if we were to discover that religious revelation or specific forms of religious revelation are as reliable as science is, or even more reliable, then they would be incorporated in science. So that's something that I'm sometimes worrying about. It not so much that scientism is self-defeating, but that it is that it can become like a trivial thing. I mean, if you assume that science is the best way of knowing, but then also say that whatever way of knowing is superior, whatever way of knowing is superior to science will have to be incorporated in science, then it is almost by definition true that science is the best way of knowing.
So if God started talking to us, then that would also become science.
Yeah, so that's what I'm not really sure about. I mean, it's a very outlandish scenario, obviously. I think in the history of science up until now, we have seen that there has never really been a radical break. I already mentioned that I don't really believe that something radically novel was discovered in the 17th century. I think you can go back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians and Indians. They were also doing something that was at least continuous with modern science. There was never really a moment where somebody came up with a radically novel way of knowing that nobody had ever thought of before. So in that sense, I think science, as we know it today, has been a gradual accretion of all these different inferences, different methods, none of which are radically different from what came before. But of course, if suddenly we discover that God is directly speaking to us and revealing the true laws of nature, for example, would we incorporate something like that into science? Yeah, but it would alter the face of science so radically that I think you would just be talking about a different thing. I mean, you could just win by definitional fight and just say, haha, so see, if God reveals himself to us, then God is just incorporated into science, so we still win. But that's kind of a lame move. So I would, my hunch there would be that you have to stake out a claim, you have to stick out your neck and say, okay, I think science is the best way of knowing, and that kind of rules out the scenario that you're describing. I think there will never be a religious method of knowing, for example, that will turn out to be more reliable than science will. I think that's a more interesting claim to make, that is also more vulnerable to refutation, than just to argue that whatever method that is discovered to be reliable will be incorporated into science, because then you're achieving some sort of a semantic victory, I think.
Oh, okay. So one last thing, like I'll just give a vague description of what I consider as a knowledge, and you just need to tell me whether it's actually a scientism or not, like according to your definition. So my thought is like we have some intuitions that we can trust, and we have some perceptions we can trust. So using those two, we infer different things, different belief. I consider those as knowledge. So belief, yeah. So is it consistent with your scientism, or is there any aspect which is opposing to your scientism?
No, I don't think it's inconsistent with scientism because again, intuitions will be by and large reliable, at least in certain contexts. So I don't really think it's unscientific for you to rely on your intuitions and also not on your the evidence of your senses. But at least you have to be open to correction. So it might turn out to be the case, for example, that you are relying on an intuition that turns out to be false. As long as your intuitions are not really conflicting with science and you're using them in the context for which they are appropriate, then I think it's perfectly legitimate for you to rely on your intuitions. But if someday scientists come up with some sort of correction of your intuitions, or if they tell you like, yeah, your senses are reliable most of the time, but actually some of the time they're not, and some of the time you're hallucinating or you're vulnerable to visual illusions, then of course you have to revise your belief. You have to defer to the authority of science when science is correcting your intuitions and your perceptions. But as long as science is not doing that, I think it's perfectly rational for you, and I do it as well, to rely on your intuitions. And it's kind of a, yeah, I sometimes think of that. I'm always fascinated by situations in which you have some sort of tacit in code intuition that you can't really put your finger on, even in a social situation. Like you don't trust someone, for example, but you can't really tell if it's his behavior, if it's his demeanor, if there's something else that you picked up on, some very subtle signal. But still, you have this feeling, you have this intuition. I can't really scientifically demonstrate it. I can't really justify it, even if you were to ask me for my reason. So why do you distrust this person? I have this feeling like there's something wrong here. But I think in those situations, it would be unrealistic to demand that you can justify everything. I mean, there's most of the things that are happening in our brain are happening below our conscious awareness, and I think it's also liberating to just to go along with the flow, to rely on an intuition that you have and that you can't really quite explain, because at some level, you know that, I mean, this this is the kind of thing that my brain evolved for. That just telling apart trustworthy people from deceitful people, for example. Yeah, that's just a classic example of an evolutionary problem that our brain has had to solve. And for these reasons, for all these reasons, I think it makes sense that it is happening below our conscious awareness, and that we can trust it. That most of the time, not all of the time, of course, it will actually be a reliable intuition that you will discover later on. For example, that this guy was really a cheat, for example, even though I couldn't really put my finger on why I didn't trust him. So there's nothing wrong, I think, for a philosopher or for a scientist to follow your intuitions, you follow your gut feelings, at least in certain contexts. There's the context for scientific demonstration, scientific proof, and there's also a context for just everyday life. I mean, this might sound a little strange because I'm a proponent of science, and I think that science is basically the only way of knowing. So ideally, I think that even the reliability of our gut feelings could be demonstrated in scientific ways, but you can't do that in everyday life. You can't wait for that in everyday life. So you have to work with whatever tools that evolution has endowed you with in that situation. So I think it's perfectly okay for you to use intuitions and gut feelings.
Yeah, and you will still consider them as knowledge, right? Even though we are not using like science for that.
I would still consider them as knowledge. Yes, it's of course knowledge of a different status. So scientific knowledge is of course more reliable, for one thing, because you can make it explicit, and because you can justify it, and basically because you can tell the range of applications, and also you can tell where it tends to lead us astray and where it is more reliable. But this depends on the level of accuracy or the level of reliability that you're expecting. In an everyday context, you don't really need those very high standards of rationality. So the understanding of knowledge that we use in everyday life is different from knowledge that we use in a scientific environment or in a scientific context. But it is also knowledge. It is knowledge of a more homely, mundane, and more provisional form. But in everyday situations, we don't really need more than that. So that's perfectly fine within that context, I think.
Yeah, you said all the beliefs must be revisable. So what about laws of logic? Like there are certain laws that they say it won't be breaking. Like, for example, laws of non-contradiction. So most philosophers say that it won't be breaking. Like, it will be true for all time. Like, it can't be revisable. It's true, necessarily true.
That is true. But all beliefs need to be revisable. But I'm not sure if the laws of logic are really beliefs. I think we need to take into account the possibility that we're just misguided about what we take to be the laws of logic. Just in the same way, for example, that mathematicians used to think that the parallel postulate was just a logical truth. That was just, I mean, they couldn't really prove it mathematically, but they had the intuition that it could not be otherwise. And then later, of course, we discovered that we actually have mathematical systems in which the parallel postulate does not hold. So what we took to be a logical truth turned out to be just an arbitrary decision that we make, and that will only hold in certain mathematical systems, but not in other mathematical systems. I think we have to take into account the possibility that something like that applies to logical truth as well. But then it's not so much logical truth that is revisable, but our imperfect understanding of logic that is revisable. So I do think that logic is not really open for negotiation or for revision, but we do have to remain skeptical about the deliverances of our own brain. So it is possible that our understanding of logic through some sort of quirk of evolutionary history is misguided. Yeah, does that more or less answer the question?
Yeah, but I get a mixed answer. I feel like I get a mixed answer. Like, is it necessarily true, or could we have been mistaken about laws of logic? Like, there are a principle of explosion which state that if laws of logic, especially the non-contradiction, is false, it follows that every proposition can be true. So we will reach such absurd conclusion if we agree that we could be mistaken about laws of non-contradiction. That's why I'm asking again, like, will we
Yeah, so
ever
you mean
make mistake on this?
paraconsistent logic?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really my field, but I would tend to think that the decision between classical logic and paraconsistent logic is primarily a function of just usefulness. There's certain logical systems that are more interesting and more useful to apply in certain situations, and we choose them on that basis. I mean, the very pragmatic consideration here would be that, I mean, it's if one single contradiction just destroys your whole belief system, because then you can derive everything. Well, that's not really that's kind of a very destructive conclusion to reach. So perhaps it would be easier if we found a logical system that can work around a single contradiction without just leveling everything to the ground. Does that mean that we're mistaken about the truth of classical logic? No, I don't think so. I think there's just certain situations in which we have figured out that just abandoning the principle of ex falso quod libet leads to more interesting results. But I was more thinking of situations like if you have a mathematical proof, you still have to check if any of the specific inferences that you're making are valid. You could be mistaken about that. That doesn't mean that the inferences themselves are false, or that the logical system that you're relying on is false. It's just that you have been applying it in a false way. So your confidence in a mathematical proof should always remain provisional, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the system of logic that you're relying on is itself open to revision. I tend to think, but again, it's not really my domain, that classical logic, by and large, is still not open for negotiation. It's just, it would work in any kind of universe. But there's just some specific context in which paraconsistent logic are more useful, or lead to more interesting or useful results.
Okay. So that will be all. We are very happy to have you. We had a wonderful discussion. One of our member joined. His name is Pradesh. Hi, Pradesh. Can you hear? I think he's on mute.
Yeah, he's muted.
Yeah.
Before we go, I just wanted to know, like earlier, Maarten, you said that science and philosophy need each other in some way. So would it be better to say that science plus philosophy is the best way of knowing things?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you construe science very broadly, of course, at some point it will also include philosophy. I do think that the disciplinary boundaries between science and philosophy are just convenient ways of dividing labor. Like the kind of problems that I'm thinking about, I mean, or not really the kinds of problems that are amenable to scientific experiments. Not because I'm not using any empirical input, because they're of a very broad, abstract, and general nature. But I publish a lot in interdisciplinary journals, for example, and I think the best philosophy is the kind of philosophy where you can't really tell if it's done by a scientist or by a philosopher. I think it's mostly bad science. The more purely philosophical something looks, and the more it is like unmoored from empirical investigations, the more likely it is, I think, that it tends to lead us astray. So I think the best philosophy is interdisciplinary philosophy, but I'm also hesitant about completely collapsing the distinction between science and philosophy. I mean, most of the time when we're reading academic journals, for example, we can tell what has been written by a scientist, what has been written by a philosopher. But I think we should be mindful of those distinctions. They are useful. They make sense. Like we have to set up departments and faculties, and we have to form research collaborations, and we have to set up scientific journals, etc. And it makes sense to focus on certain areas and to divide up the work. But that doesn't mean that there's really any fundamental epistemological differences between science and philosophy. There are certain scientific breakthroughs, for example, that were really philosophical in nature. Just think of Einstein's thought experiments about the nature of time. To some extent, that's exactly what philosophers are doing. So it will be very hard to disentangle philosophy from science as well. I mean, some scientists are quite condescending when it comes to philosophy. They say that they don't want to have anything to do with it, but I think they're mistaken. I think without knowing it, they're taking on philosophical baggage, and hopefully it's baggage that is well examined and that is supported by good arguments. But there's no such thing as pure science or pure philosophy, or to the extent that there is, it's probably not very fruitful. But it's a good question. Could I say that science plus philosophy is the only way of knowing? Yeah, that would be. I'm not really hung up on the definition of science. I'm interested in how to solve questions, how to answer interesting questions, and I think we need the combinations of the methods that are traditionally associated with science and philosophy. But I would still emphasize the point that these methods are much more inextricably intertwined than they are usually thought of.
Yeah,
we guess we already gone half hour more than
that's fine.
what we agree upon.
If you have a final question, it's fine. I'm not really in a hurry, but I see it's.
I think you can just say what you're working on right now, Maarten, and where to find more stuff about you.
I'm a little bit all over the place. So most of the things that I've been talking about now really bring me back to my PhD dissertation, and also the book that I compiled in 2017 with Massimo Pigliucci, Scientism and the Limits of Science. Now I'm mostly working on different topics. So I'm writing some papers on conspiracy theories, just the epistemology of conspiracy theories, what makes them so attractive and so alluring, how they evolve and develop, how they protect themselves against refutation and criticism. I'm also getting more interested in climate change. So I wrote a paper on nuclear energy and climate change. Basically defending nuclear energy as a sort of insurance policy against failure in case that 100% renewables would not work, because the nuclear energy has a very attractive profile to solve the climate problem, I think. And the latest thing I'm working on, but that's really just still in very early embryonic stage, is a paper on the evolution of artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of buzz now around AI, and also the existential risks that some philosophers worry about in the context of AI. So the idea is here to apply an evolutionary framework to the development of artificial intelligence, and then see if a situation in which AI could develop selfishness and instincts for self-preservation in the same way that we have, because we're creatures that evolved. If that were to happen in the context of AI, could that lead to dangerous situations? If we have a form of super intelligence that is also hungry for dominance and for acquiring of resources, and that is having an instinct of self-preservation, that could be a very dangerous situation. So that's one topic that we're exploring, but I'm a little bit all over the place. So I think it's good for, as a philosopher, I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. So I collaborate with psychologists, with physicists, and yeah, I think that's good. Also, it's in philosophy, it's tempting to sit in your philosophical armchair and to speculate about the nature of reality, and not to associate yourself with scientific work. But again, as I have already explained, like everything that I've been saying is about the mutual interdependence between science and philosophy, and trying to collaborate with scientists and pursue interesting questions and try to solve them together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think a paperclip maximizer would kill all of us in the future? If we are not
I think that's an outlandish. That's not the kind of scenario that I'm worried about. It's because the paperclip scenario is not really an AI that is hungry for domination. It is basically based on some sort of misunderstanding. Like the AI just thinks that all we care about is paperclip, and then it's so monomaniacally obsessed with paperclips that it would just convert the whole universe into paperclips. That I think that's really for me a bizarre and very improbable scenario, because I couldn't imagine why we couldn't just tell this AI, like, Jesus, don't be so obsessed with paperclips. I mean, here's a way to clarify what we meant. Like, we care about paperclips, but we care about a lot of other things as well. So to have an AI that is at the same time super intelligent and still as stupid not to understand what we mean by the instruction to make paperclips, that I think is hard to make sense of. What I'm more thinking of here is that an AI has would develop certain interests of its own, that it would really become an agent with interests of its own that would escape from our control. In the case of the AI paperclip maker, it's really like an obedient AI that is misunderstanding what we mean, and that is slavishly following instructions in a way that is completely destructive, in a way that it doesn't understand. But the thing that I'm thinking of is an evolved creature that has certain intentions and goals of its own that are different, of course, from the ones of its maker. So that, for me, I'm not sure. Like, I'm still working on it. That would be the most plausible scenario in which an AI would completely escape our control. So evolution is a dangerous process in that regard. Evolution is all about ruthless competition. So if we set up a sort of evolutionary environment in which we allow different AI systems to compete with each other, to struggle for resources, to kill and defeat each other, and then we do that for many generations, then yeah, then we can come up with very dangerous creatures indeed. So that's a scenario that I'm exploring now. The sort of evolved AIs that have been bred into selfishness and hunger for dominance.
So we are actually very excited. We are planning to bring more philosophers to our channel. We basically started this channel like 2 years, 1.5 years back. Like that time I just left Islam. Then I was struggling with all this apologetics thing. Like they actually want me to take back to the fold of Islam, but they are giving me arguments. So I was like, I want to learn whether these arguments are true or not. That's how I get into this philosophy thing. And later I met these folks like Zeeman over here and all. Then we form a team. That's why we create a group. Like most of the atheists in Kerala, primarily their approach towards religion is they do textual criticism. They do not actually take the philosophy route. They just do the textual criticism. So most of them were unable to answer when they came up with arguments such as kalam, contingency, fine-tuning. So somebody has to answer, right? So that's why we took
that's
the
cool.
task.
So how long has this channel been existing already?
1.5 years.
Yeah. So you already had, I think you mentioned Graham Oppie, is that right? Was he on the show?
Yeah, Graham. Yeah. Yes, Graham Oppie.
And who else?
Alex Malpass.
Okay, great.
Michael Humer.
Michael Humer, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, now I have you.
How did you come across my work again?
Uh,
Mostly the
yeah,
scientism book?
there's another atheist group who promote scientism. So
Yeah,
we made a video critiquing scientism. So he
yeah,
replied, actually quoting you. So we thought, first of all, I read the book, like the
yeah,
Science Unlimited. I read your chapter, so I was like interested to get your views. So I
yeah.
also have a couple of questions. That's why I mailed you. That's the
Great, yeah.
reason.
And are you already thinking of the next guests to invite in for an English speaking?
I was planning to do some videos on epistemology. Like, I started epistemology using the traditional approach, but now I am moving towards the naturalistic epistemology.
Yeah,
So, so I want to do a couple of videos, like why I made the decision.
it's always interesting to talk about things that you had a change of mind about, like that you can
Yeah,
explain, because then you can really still adopt the perspective of the other position, like because you have been defending it, you know what it means, and then
yeah,
you
correct,
somehow
correct.
reasoned your way out of it.
Mhm.
Yeah, you can
And
apply it to your own.
we were thinking of getting some philosophy of mind guys in, so because there are a lot of confusion among us, so we thought we'll get some. I don't know if Philip Goff or somebody would be ready to come, so we were thinking of
Philip Goff, the
that.
guy from
The
the background in
Pansexes guy,
scientism.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. I mean, I don't know him personally. I don't think. I think panpsychism is a pretty ridiculous idea, but but he could be up for a.
Yeah.
But I think it's also it's interesting perhaps to make also to as an example of the point that even something like panpsychism could potentially be scientifically demonstrated. Like I don't
Mm.
really see any experiment that would settle the matter right now, but
Mm.
who knows? I mean, it is something we have to expand our horizon and think of some. That I think is something that philosophers are good at. Just um, coming up with counterfactual scenarios that are so outlandish that they would probably never occur to scientists, but that can still be helpful in drawing out a certain hidden premise, for example, because I think it's mostly thinking of the counterfactuals that help me realize why methodological naturalism is not really a good principle in science. It's only thinking of not just our universe or our world, but thinking of the potential worlds that we could be living in. So that I think perhaps that is something that philosophers are more yeah, they can also get like totally carried away with with fictional words and with counterfactuals and with like parallel universe, etc. But I think sometimes it is useful even to talk about our universe, think of how things could have been, because we take a lot of things for granted, even the way that science evolved in our universe, because we don't really have a reference point. We only have the emergence and development of science in our universe. But just thinking of even supernatural universes in which the God of Islam existed, that's interesting, and to think of what that would mean and how we could figure that out. And
So,
I
do you
mean,
have any preferred
most.
views when it comes to mind, like straightforward physicalism, illusionism, eliminatism? Do you have any preferred views?
for my own metaphysical, I guess, yeah, naturalism, obviously, but that's a bit of a catch-all term. So I think I'm a physicalist as well. Yeah.
Like a
Yes.
straightforward physicalism, like the heart problem is just, what do you say? How do you do that
Yeah.
with the heart?
I think the heart problem. I'm not as a die-hard physicalist like Rosenberg, Alex Rosenberg, who doesn't believe that mental states or intentions exist and that it's basically only elementary particles. So I do believe in that mental states can supervene on physical qualities. But I am a physicalist in the sense that I don't really think there's a heart problem. I mean, consciousness is obviously very difficult to solve, but it's not the hard problem in the way that David Chalmers envisaged it. So I think it's perfectly amenable to scientific investigation. The worst possible scenario is that our brains are just not up to the task. So the solution that Colin McGinn has proposed that I already mentioned, which is kind of a physicalist solution. So consciousness is just a property of certain physical entities like brains or human bodies, and there's a perfectly decent physicalist explanation for that. It's just that we will never understand it, not because it's intrinsically difficult, but just because that's not the way our brains evolved. I think that's an interesting thought. I'm more optimistic about it, but I would have to admit that at this point we really don't have a clue about consciousness. It's also like we don't really know also what animals are conscious. I think we're way too confident about pronouncing that this or that animal is capable of sentience or consciousness or experiencing pain or suffering or anything like that. But I'm definitely a physicalist. I think that there's nothing spooky or mysterious or supernatural or dualist about consciousness.
Yeah, I think Razi's audio was off when he said that.
Oh, I just said thanks very much and bye.
Yeah, right.
Like we are really
thanks
taking too much
for
of
having
your
me.
time.
I hope you enjoyed it or you took something out of it. It was definitely great to talk to you guys. And good luck with the rest of the show.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.